The sprawling 50-acre farm had been in the family for generations, a steadfast symbol of resilience and hard work. It was more than just land. It was a legacy, a testament to the protagonist's grandfather, a World War II veteran who had returned home and built it from the ground up. Every inch of the soil held stories of perseverance, from the first crops planted in the post-war years to the barn that had been raised by neighbors in an old-fashioned community effort. It was a place where tradition reigned supreme, where hard work bore tangible results, and where the protagonist had spent his childhood learning the value of honest labor. When his grandfather passed away, leaving the farm to him, it was both an honor and a responsibility. He had left behind a stable career in the city to embrace this life fully, believing in the sanctity of family heritage. But the world had changed. The neighboring town, once filled with family-owned businesses and modest homes, had given way to planned communities, complete with pristine sidewalks, manicured lawns, and the iron grip of a homeowners association. The protagonist had no interest in their carefully curated version of perfection. His farm stood as a stark contrast to the surrounding cookie-cutter houses, and it wasn't long before the HOA of Pinecrest set its sights on him, determined to erase what they saw as an eyesore from their landscape. First, it was subtle, polite letters in his mailbox, offering to buy the farm for a sum that barely scratched its real value. The HOA representatives, dressed in their crisp blazers and polished smiles, made it sound like a golden opportunity. You wouldn't have to deal with all the upkeep, they assured him. Think of the convenience, the security. But he had no intention of selling. The moment he refused, their tactics changed. The polite suggestions turned into passive-aggressive complaints, each one more absurd than the last. First, it was the color of his barn, which they claimed clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. Then, it was the sound of his tractor in the early mornings, deemed a disruption to community harmony. They even tried to enforce a landscaping standard that had nothing to do with farmland, but was clearly designed to make his property appear unkempt and undesirable. The protagonist saw through the charade. This wasn't about property values or aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA wanted his land, and they were willing to make his life miserable until he gave in. The months passed, and the protagonist continued to resist. The HOA's efforts grew more aggressive. With the election of a new HOA president, Rebecca Winters, things took a turn for the worse. Rebecca was not a woman who took no for an answer. Armed with the legal expertise of her right-hand man, attorney Richard Thompson, she made it her personal mission to force the protagonist out. Unlike her predecessors, who had tried to wear him down with nuisance complaints, Rebecca had a more systematic approach. Her first move was to pressure the local government to enforce obscure zoning regulations that had never been an issue before. Then came the legal threats, vague but menacing, designed to make him second-guess his ability to fight back. Richard Thompson, with his smug demeanor and perfectly tailored suits, handled the paperwork, sending a flurry of official-looking documents meant to intimidate. The protagonist wasn't easily scared, but he was beginning to understand the depth of their determination. They weren't just hoping he would leave, they were actively working to destroy his way of life. The situation reached a breaking point when the protagonist returned from a weekend trip with his young daughter to find something that made his blood run cold. A train track, an actual physical railway, had been constructed right through the middle of his crops. The destruction was immediate and irreversible. His best cornfield, the one that had yielded the most successful harvest for years, was nothing more than a wasteland of crushed stalks and exposed soil. The HOA, predictably, was unapologetic. Their reasoning was absurd, a community transit project that had somehow been fast-tracked without his consent. The paperwork was a mess of falsified signatures and backdated approvals, all of which supposedly gave them the right to build on his property. When he confronted them, Rebecca feigned sympathy. "It's unfortunate," she said with a practiced frown. "But we're willing to offer you compensation, at market value, of course." The amount was laughable, a fraction of what his crops would have earned him. It wasn't an offer, it was a final push, a clear message that he was fighting a losing battle. But they had made a mistake, one crucial oversight in their rush to seize control. As the protagonist scoured through decades-old property records, determined to find any legal loophole to fight back, he stumbled upon something astonishing. The very headquarters of the HOA, the pristine office from which they issued their iron-fisted rules, had been built on land that legally belonged to his farm. A forgotten surveying error from decades past had placed the HOA's building within his property lines. Armed with this knowledge, he took his findings to a trusted attorney, who confirmed the truth. He wasn't just a victim of the HOA's tyranny. He was, by all legal definitions, their landlord. The revelation changed everything. They had spent months trying to force him out, but now he held the ultimate leverage. And he knew exactly how to use it. For the first time in months, the protagonist felt a surge of control over the situation. The HOA had been ruthless, but their arrogance had led them to overlook a critical detail: the very ground they operated from wasn't theirs to claim. His lawyer, a sharp-minded local attorney with a reputation for fighting corporate overreach, wasted no time in verifying the claim. Old survey maps, deed transfers, and legal documents all pointed to the same irrefutable conclusion: the HOA had unknowingly built their headquarters on his family's land. The realization was almost poetic. They had spent all this time harassing him, issuing complaints about his property, trying to force him into compliance, while they themselves were squatting on his land. With legal confirmation in hand, the protagonist wasted no time planning his next move. He wasn't just going to expose their hypocrisy. He was going to ensure they paid for every ounce of misery they had caused. And he knew exactly how to hit them where it hit. Rather than opting for a direct eviction, the protagonist devised a far more impactful strategy. Instead of keeping the building for himself or selling it back to the HOA, he decided to donate it, specifically to a charity called Veterans Rebuilding America. The organization helped former servicemen and women reintegrate into society by providing job training, community support, and resources for those struggling with post-military life. It was a perfect fit, aligning with the values his grandfather had held dear. The irony was unmistakable. The HOA, which had tormented him and tried to erase his family's legacy, would now find themselves displaced in favor of a cause they couldn't possibly argue against without ruining their already crumbling reputation. With the donation paperwork drafted and legally binding, he prepared for the next step, the moment that would shatter the HOA's illusion of control once and for all. The morning of the takeover was unforgettable. Armed with legal documents and a locksmith, the protagonist arrived at the HOA headquarters unannounced. The moment he stepped into the building, all eyes were on him. Rebecca Winters and Richard Thompson were in the middle of a meeting when he walked straight to the front desk and handed over the papers. "This building isn't yours anymore," he said calmly. "As of today, it belongs to Veterans Rebuilding America." The front desk receptionist, clearly flustered, stammered something about needing to check with management, but the protagonist didn't wait for permission. The locksmith got to work immediately, changing the locks as HOA board members rushed into the lobby, demanding answers. Rebecca's face turned a deep shade of red, her carefully composed facade cracking as she realized she was utterly powerless. Richard Thompson, ever the lawyer, tried to argue, waving legal threats in the air, but the protagonist's lawyer shut him down with a single phrase: "We have full legal ownership. Your lease, if you ever had one, is officially terminated." The realization hit them all at once. The building, their base of operations, their entire command center, was gone. The news spread like wildfire. The local media caught wind of the scandal, and within hours, cameras were stationed outside the now-reclaimed building, capturing the humiliating downfall of Pinecrest's HOA leadership. Residents who had once blindly followed Rebecca's rule were now turning against her, furious that their association fees had been funneled into an illegal headquarters. Worse yet, the discovery of falsified permits and the unauthorized train track construction came to light, adding fuel to the growing outrage. The protagonist made sure to grant interviews, calmly explaining the ordeal from beginning to end. He painted a clear picture of an HOA so obsessed with power that they had broken the law multiple times, all while pretending to uphold community standards. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. HOA members who had once supported Rebecca demanded answers. Some filed complaints. Others resigned altogether, unwilling to be associated with such blatant corruption. The pressure mounted, and within a week, Rebecca Winters found herself in an inescapable position. Under mounting scrutiny, Rebecca Winters had no choice but to step down as HOA president. Her iron grip on the community had shattered, her credibility reduced to dust. Richard Thompson fared no better. His involvement in falsifying legal documents led to an ethics investigation by the State Bar Association. The once feared lawyer now faced the very real possibility of losing his license. In a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of the HOA, the remaining board members scrambled to find a new leader, eventually settling on Ellen, a longtime resident known for her fair-minded approach. Unlike her predecessor, Ellen didn't see the protagonist as an enemy. Instead, she reached out to him, acknowledging the HOA's wrongdoing and proposing a genuine resolution. "We want to make this right," she admitted. "What do we need to do?" It was a rare moment of sincerity, one the protagonist chose to meet with measured diplomacy. The damage had been done, but there was still a chance to rebuild, not just the farm, but the entire community's sense of integrity. The protagonist had no interest in petty revenge. He wanted justice and the full restoration of his farm. With Rebecca Winters ousted and Richard Thompson facing legal scrutiny, the remaining members of the HOA, led by Ellen, were in damage control mode. In their desperation to salvage what was left of their reputation, they finally did what they should have done from the beginning. They listened. The protagonist laid out his terms with unwavering clarity. First, the illegal train tracks had to be removed immediately, and the land they had destroyed needed to be restored to its original state, at the HOA's expense. Second, they had to compensate him fairly for the crops they had destroyed. No insulting lowball offers, just the full market value of what he had lost. Third, moving forward, they would cease all harassment, complaints, and petty citations against him and his farm. The HOA had two options: meet his demands, or face a prolonged legal battle they were destined to lose. The choice was obvious. Under Ellen's leadership, the HOA begrudgingly accepted the terms, and an official agreement was drafted. For the first time in years, the farm's future was secure, but the protagonist had one more move to make that would ensure this never happened again. With the HOA headquarters now legally belonging to Veterans Rebuilding America, the transition began swiftly. What had once been a hub of bureaucratic tyranny was transformed into a center for meaningful change. Veterans now occupied the space, using it to host community building events, provide job training programs, and offer support services to those struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. It was a powerful, symbolic victory. The very building that had once been used to bully and control the community was now a beacon of service and restoration. The irony wasn't lost on the residents of Pine Crest. Many who had once been passive supporters of the HOA's rule found themselves inspired by the new occupants of the building. Some even volunteered their time, finally engaging with their community in a way that didn't involve fines and enforcement notices. The protagonist, who had once been treated as an outsider and a nuisance, was now seen as a leader. He hadn't just saved his farm, he had changed the entire landscape of the neighborhood. Despite the past animosity, the protagonist saw an opportunity to mend the fractures within the community. Rather than isolate himself from the HOA and its members, he chose to be part of the solution. With his encouragement, a joint initiative was launched, a community garden that would be managed collaboratively by the farm, the veterans, and local residents. The idea was simple but powerful: a shared space where people could contribute, learn, and reconnect with the land. The farm provided the soil and resources, the veterans contributed their labor and skills, and the residents of Pinecrest, many of whom had never grown a thing in their lives, were given a chance to cultivate something real. It was a project that transcended past divisions, creating a tangible symbol of unity. Slowly, the resentment faded. Neighbors who had once signed petitions against him now worked beside him, planting vegetables and flowers in soil that had once been a battleground. The protagonist had proven that community wasn't about rigid rules and enforced uniformity. It was about people, working together, for something greater than themselves. As the farm returned to its full glory, the protagonist found a new purpose beyond just preserving his grandfather's legacy. He was now shaping a legacy of his own. The crops flourished once more, and this time, he made a conscious decision to give back. A portion of each harvest was donated directly to Veterans Rebuilding America, ensuring that those who had served their country would never go hungry. The act wasn't just about charity, it was a tribute to the man who had built the farm, a veteran himself, who had instilled in his grandson the values of resilience, honor, and community. Standing in the fields, watching his daughter run through the same rows of corn he had once played in as a child, he felt a deep sense of peace. The land was safe, the farm was thriving, and the fight was over. More importantly, he had proven that some things, family, history, and integrity, were worth defending at any cost. With the dust settled and the old regime of the HOA dismantled, the protagonist was faced with a surprising offer. Ellen, recognizing his leadership and dedication to the community, asked him to serve on an advisory board for the new HOA leadership. It was an ironic turn of events. After spending so much time fighting against the HOA, he was now being asked to help guide it. But rather than dismiss the idea, he considered it carefully. If he took the role, he could ensure that what had happened to him would never happen to anyone else. No more power-hungry leaders, no more underhanded legal maneuvers, just a community looking out for one another. After much thought, he agreed. As a board member, he didn't push for unnecessary rules or rigid enforcement. Instead, he focused on transparency, fairness, and true community engagement. The HOA, once feared and resented, became an organization that actually served its residents. And with that final decision, the protagonist completed the transformation, not just of his farm, but of Pinecrest itself. Though the farm had been restored, the protagonist couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. The scars left behind by the HOA's relentless campaign weren't just on his land. They were in the way his daughter flinched when a letter arrived in the mail, in the distrust that still lingered between some neighbors, and in the sheer exhaustion that came from fighting a battle he never should have had to fight. For months, the farm had felt like a war zone, and now that the dust had settled, the silence felt almost foreign. But the land had a way of healing, just as people did. Each sunrise over the cornfields, each harvest that yielded healthy crops, each neighbor who stopped by the farmer's market stand to buy produce or just chat, it all helped to mend what had been broken. He had won, but more than that, he had reclaimed something deeper, the right to live on his own terms, without fear of being forced out of the place that had always Rebecca Winters, once the unchallenged ruler of Pinecrest, had vanished from public view. Her resignation had been swift, but the damage to her reputation was irreparable. She had become a pariah in the very neighborhood she once controlled, her former supporters now distancing themselves in shame or anger. With legal investigations looming over her head and whispers of financial mismanagement circulating, she made the inevitable decision. She moved away. There was no grand announcement, no farewell gathering. One day, a moving truck pulled into her driveway, and by nightfall, she was gone. For the protagonist, it was a fitting end. He didn't revel in her downfall. He had never fought this battle out of spite. But there was a sense of justice in knowing that she had been forced to live with the consequences of her choices, just as she had tried to force them upon him. As far as he was concerned, she was nothing more than a bitter memory now, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is obuse. Unlike Winters, Richard Thompson didn't have the luxury of a quiet exit. His involvement in the fraudulent train track permits and the illegal occupation of the HOA headquarters had not gone unnoticed. A formal ethics complaint had been filed against him, and the State Bar Association had launched an investigation into his actions. The protagonist had little doubt that Thompson would try to weasel his way out of it. Lawyers like him always did. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the backdated documents, the clear intent to manipulate the legal system for personal gain, it was all there in black and white. His license to practice law was now in jeopardy, and the once arrogant attorney found himself fighting to save his own career. It was poetic justice. He had used the law as a weapon to terrorize an innocent man, and now, the very same system was turning against him. The protagonist didn't care what happened to Thompson in the end. Whether he lost his license or managed to worm his way into another firm, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he would never be able to use his legal tricks to threaten someone like this again. With the HOA ordeal finally behind him, the protagonist turned his full attention to what he had always wanted to do: grow the farm, not just for himself, but for those in need. The partnership with Veterans Rebuilding America became more than just a donation of a building. It turned into a full-fledged collaboration. He set aside a dedicated portion of his land to grow crops specifically for the organization, ensuring that veterans and their families always had fresh, homegrown food available. It became a passion project, one that connected him even more deeply to the land his grandfather had cultivated before him. Schools in the area even began bringing students on field trips, teaching kids about farming, sustainability, and the importance of community. The farm was no longer just a private family estate. It had become a symbol of something greater. It was a place of history, resilience, and generosity, and for the first time in a long time, the protagonist felt at peace knowing that his grandfather's legacy was not just preserved, but expanded in ways he never could have imagined. Looking back, the protagonist realized that everything he had gone through, the threats, the sabotage, the relentless battle against the HOA, had led him to this point. If he had given in, if he had sold the farm when they first pressured him, none of this would have happened. The veterans wouldn't have a new headquarters, the community wouldn't have healed, and the farm wouldn't have flourished in the way it had. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for the idea that some things are worth protecting at any cost. Now, as he watched his daughter run through the fields, the same way he once had as a child, he knew he had done the right thing. She would grow up with the same deep connection to the land that he had, learning the values of hard work, perseverance, and community. The farm would outlive him, just as it had outlived his grandfather, and just as it would for generations to come. And with that thought, he finally let go of the last remnants of the battle, ready to embrace the future, not as a man at war, but as a man at home.